The 20th century's most successful political idea is under attack. Democracy is facing a crisis of confidence.
The quality of democracy is in decline.
A gap is growing between people and the political elites elected to represent them. Powerful interests have corrupted the ways people are governed.
It was very frustrating because people were dying.
And fledgling democracies are increasingly succumbing to the lure of autocracy.
Yani Tayyip Erdoğan güçlü bir lider. Biz de sonuna kadar arkasındayız.
But how deep is this crisis? And how worried should the world be?
La rage du peuple, je la vois tous les samedis. On n'a plus un franc, plus de quoi remplir un caddie. Chaque fin de mois on crève la dalle. Je te parle pas d'appétit, il suffisait de quelques gilets jaunes pour que petit à petit on se bouge.
This Dan has become a young voice of the Gilets jaunes, the nationwide protest movement against the French government. At its height in 2018, the movement made headlines around the world. Distan's music videos have had millions of views online.
Les jeunes, quel est votre métier? Oh, tout ça, ça se passe en France. Montrez-le au monde entier, d'accord? Il n'y a pas de démocratie, ça n'existe pas. Voilà, on est des révolutionnaires, sachez-le, le monde entier. On se bat pour des causes nobles.
France for a long time had a system in which a group of very highly qualified technocrats and politicians were entrusted to run the country for everybody's benefit. And they did very well out of it, but the whole country did well out of it. That system started to break down as early as the 1990s. It came to a head more recently with the Gilets jaunes.
Parce que le projet qui est le mien pour vous, ça n'est pas de rassembler la gauche, ça n'est pas de rassembler la droite, c'est de rassembler les Françaises et les Français, d'aller vers la haine.
In 2017, France's president, Emmanuel Macron, came to power at the head of a brand new party, promising a new and more representative kind of politics. But 2 years in, and Emmanuel Macron's critics say he's just another fully paid-up member of France's traditional political class. The growing disconnect between people and elected politicians in France is part of a wider trend in the West. Since the failed wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, politicians have increasingly been viewed as incompetent. After the global financial crisis, bankers in the City of London and Wall Street had to be bailed out. Ordinary people, on the other hand, were expected to pay for it by enduring austerity.
The problem in countries in the West is that the quality of democracy is in decline. You see people less satisfied that the democracies they live in are producing the goods. You see people more cynical about their politicians, less ready to believe that politicians are working on their behalf.
In the world's most powerful democracy, that sense of cynicism towards elected representatives is growing. Today, only 17% of Americans say they can trust the government to do what is right, compared with 40% in 2000. In a representative democracy, the electorate mostly only get a say at the ballot box. That means the system relies on voters' interests being effectively protected by those they elect. In American politics, lobbying plays a central role in helping politicians make informed choices.
The idea is that the senator or congressman takes an enlightened and broad view of his or her constituents' interests. It is important that they hear from business and they hear from, non-profits, from a lot of interest groups who have their own perspective.
The problem in American democracy today is that the interests of business often drown out those of citizens. In 2018, $3.5 billion was spent on lobbying in Washington, up from $1.6 billion in 2000. And of the 100 organizations that spent the most on lobbying, 95 represent business. That can have a real impact on ordinary people.
The nation is in the midst of an unprecedented opioid epidemic.
America's opioid crisis is rampant, with an average of 115 opioid deaths each day.
Drug overdoses are now the leading cause of accidental death in our country, and this is a total epidemic.
The opioid crisis is one example of how lobbying by wealthy companies has clashed with the interests of the electorate. While some pharmaceutical companies sought to push opioids as a miracle cure for pain, millions of Americans became addicted.
My dream was to join an Olympic team someday. So I went to gymnastics practice for 4.5 hours every day of the week. And I never thought in a million years that this is where my life would be.
Elena is one of the victims of the opioid crisis. She now does outreach work, helping other drug addicts on the streets of San Francisco.
Hey, you need husband.
Hey, how's it going?
In 2010, age 16, she was injured in a car crash and prescribed opioids to relieve the pain.
I thought I was dead, you know, and I woke up 2 days later in the hospital. I was on a drip, and I remember thinking to myself, you know, I really like the way this feels.
Elena soon became addicted to the pills she was given and found doctors were only too happy to keep on prescribing.
They were writing scripts for opioid painkillers like candy. Addiction is like being in jail. You can't just like open the door and walk out of it. You can't. You're in that, and it holds you there.
At the time, this was a pattern sweeping across America. In Washington, most politicians were slow to tackle this growing opioid crisis. Since 2000, pharmaceutical companies have spent over $4 billion lobbying and funding election campaigns in Washington. Although not all of this relates to opioids, it compares with just $4 million spent by groups lobbying to limit opioid use. This huge disparity meant that pharmaceutical companies were able to limit attempts to change opioid prescribing patterns for years.
It was very frustrating.
One of the things you can ask yourself is, why do businesses spend what they do? The extraordinarily large sums that are being spent is an indication of just what they expect the political system to give them in return. If constituents feel that their voice is completely drowned out and that Washington is producing bad policies because in effect it's being bought, then that is a failure of democracy.
We are going to Washington, D.C., and we are going to drain the swamp.
Spending on lobbying has increased by 9%.
We are going to Washington, D.C., and we are going to drain the swamp.
Spending on lobbying has increased by 9% since Donald Trump moved into the White House, despite him running on the promise of cleaning up Washington.
You know, that phrase started about a week ago, and I thought it was terrible. I didn't like it at all. I said, I don't know, I just don't like it. The people like it, that's much more important.
President Trump won the election by playing on the sense of dissatisfaction with the political status quo.
We must protect our borders from the ravages of other countries, making our products, stealing our companies, and destroying our jobs.
Playing on grievance is a more sure way to power, and that is otherwise known as populism.
President Trump is part of a wider trend. Since the 1990s, 46 populist leaders or parties have been in power in 33 democratic countries.
The worry about populism is that playing on people's grievances and exaggerating their differences tends to make the political system less healthy, and that, of course, is bad for democracy.
Democracies are historically thought to die by the barrel of a gun. But today, they are just as at risk of being strangled slowly by populist leaders, claiming to act in the name of the people. When Recep Tayyip Erdogan became Prime Minister of Turkey in 2003, he was a force for democracy, standing up to the army, which had launched one coup after another. Over the years, he has consistently been elected, but power has corrupted the president, and the country has slipped into autocracy. In 2016, a faction of the military attempted a coup, but it failed, and President Erdogan ramped up his consolidation of power. Today marks 3 years since the failed coup attempt, and President Erdogan's supporters are celebrating the anniversary.
Yani Tayyip Erdoğan güçlü bir lider. Biz de sonuna kadar arkasındayız.
Turkey is now one of the least democratic countries in Europe, but the president still retains the support of around half the population. The president has claimed to be defending democracy, while actually eroding it. Since the coup attempt, he has purged the state bureaucracy and civil society, arresting around 80,000 people and censoring the media. Democracies across the world are suffering from a crisis of confidence, but they can renew themselves.
Democracy is not an all or nothing entity. People are feeling their democracies are not as healthy as they were. They're less satisfied with them. Does that mean they're no longer democracies? Of course it doesn't. That's ridiculous. But it does mean that the quality of their democracies decreased.
Today, around 10% less of the world's population live in a full democracy compared with a decade ago. Inspiration may come from unlikely places, countries where democracy does not exist.
On the streets of Moscow and Hong Kong, young people who never lived in a democracy realize there's something dignified about democracy, and it's something we need to remember, that if we're lucky enough to have been born in democracy, it's worth striving for.